In 2014, in a quiet office in Brattleboro, Vermont, an attorney opened the estate documents of a man named Ronald Reed. The man had spent his life pumping gas and sweeping floors. He drove an old car. He wore a coat held together with safety pins. And when that attorney read the number on the page in front of him, he stopped. Because Ronald Reed, the janitor, the gas station attendant, the man nobody in Brattleboro had ever looked at twice, had died with $8 million. And not one single person in his life had known. Not his neighbors, not his coworkers, not even most of his own family. He had built something extraordinary over decades in complete and total silence. And that silence was not an accident. It was the strategy. Here is what most people never get told. Ronald Reed was not lucky. He did not inherit money. He did not get a tip from the right person at the right time. What he had was one specific behavior, one thing he practiced without exception for nearly 70 years, that he shared with almost every extraordinary fortune ever quietly built in American history. And in the next 10 minutes, you're going to find out exactly what that behavior is, why the science behind it is more powerful than most people realize, and how 3 men, including Ronald Reed, used it to build things that stunned the world. But before we go any further, if you have ever told someone about a plan you were excited about and watched that plan slowly lose its energy in the days that followed, this video is going to explain exactly why that happened and what to do instead. Before we go further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if stories like this move you, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we uncover next on the Silent Fortunes. Ronald Reed was not unusual in his silence. He was unusual in how far that silence took him. Because when you look at the most extraordinary fortunes ever built in American history, not the ones that were announced, celebrated, and posted about, but the ones that quietly accumulated while the world was looking somewhere else, you find the same pattern running through almost all of them. The people who built the most built quietly. They did not announce their plans. They did not seek validation from the people around them. They did not post their goals and wait for encouragement. They simply built, in silence, and let the results speak when the results were ready to speak. This is deeply counterintuitive in the world we live in today. We exist in a culture that treats the announcement as if it is the achievement. A culture that rewards the post about the plan as enthusiastically as it rewards the plan actually working. And the science behind why that is so damaging to real achievement is something most people never hear because it does not sell well in a world built on visibility and validation. But the research is clear. When you tell someone about a goal you are working toward, your brain receives a small but real social reward from the telling itself. That reward partially satisfies the psychological need that was supposed to drive the work. You feel, very briefly, like you have already made progress. And that feeling quietly reduces the urgency that would have kept you moving. Ronald Reed never gave his brain that shortcut. Neither did 2 other men whose stories you are about to hear. Colonel Sanders, who built one of the most recognized brands in American history from the back seat of a car that nobody paid any attention to, and John Paul DeJoria, who was homeless twice and built $2 billion empires while the people around him had no idea what he was doing. What did these 3 men know about silence that the rest of America had never figured out? That is exactly what the next several minutes are going to answer. Ronald Reed's story is the purest example of this principle ever lived. For decades, he woke up early, went to work at the gas station on Putney Road in Brattleboro, Vermont, pumped gas for his neighbors, swept floors at the local JCPenney, and came home. And then, quietly, with whatever money was left after his basic needs were met, he bought stocks. Blue-chip American companies, J.P. Morgan Chase, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, Berkshire Hathaway, purchased slowly, held patiently, dividends reinvested without exception. Week after week, year after year, decade after decade. And he told nobody. Not the people he worked beside every day. Not the customers he served for years at that gas station. Not his neighbors who watched him drive the same old car and wear the same worn coat held together with safety pins. Not even most of his own family. When the estate documents were opened in 2014, not one single person in Ronald Reed's life could have predicted what was in them. $8 million. From a man who had given every person around him absolutely no reason to suspect it was coming. And that was not an accident. Ronald Reed understood something that most people spend their entire lives never learning. that the moment you announce what you are building, you begin to lose the psychological pressure that makes you finish it. In 2009, a researcher at New York University named Peter Gallwitzer published findings that confirmed what Ronald Read had apparently understood instinctively for decades: that people who announce identity-related goals to others are significantly less likely to follow through on them than people who keep those goals entirely private. The social acknowledgement of the intention, Gallwitzer found, gives the brain a taste of the recognition that was supposed to come at the end. And once the brain has had that taste, the urgency fades. Ronald Read never let the urgency fade. He never gave anyone the chance to acknowledge what he was doing. He just kept doing it, in silence, for 70 years. Ronald Read is not the only man in American history who understood this. 60 years before his estate was opened in Brattleboro, on a highway in Kentucky, a 62-year-old man sat alone in his car with a pressure cooker in the back seat and $105 in his hand, and he was quietly proving the exact same principle in a completely different way. In 1964, Harlan Sanders was driving alone across America in a car that nobody was paying attention to, wearing a white suit that was beginning to show its age, with a pressure cooker in the back seat and a chicken recipe that the rest of the world had already decided was not worth much. He had lost his restaurant in Corbin, Kentucky when the interstate highway bypassed his town and took his customers with it. He was 62 years old. He had $105 from a Social Security check, and he was driving from restaurant to restaurant, walking into kitchens he had never been in before, cooking his chicken for owners who more often than not turned him away, offering a handshake deal worth a few cents per piece of chicken sold. And he told nobody what he was building. He did not call his family and tell them he was in the process of creating a franchise empire. He did not seek encouragement from friends who might have talked him into something safer. He drove, and he cooked, and he kept going, in the same quiet way that Ronald Read had kept buying stocks in Brattleboro, Vermont, while nobody around him had any idea what was accumulating. Every person who encountered Harlan Sanders during those years on the road saw the same thing: an old man in a white suit going nowhere in particular. The restaurant owners who turned him away saw a man past his time. The people who knew him saw someone who probably should have accepted retirement and stopped. Not one of them knew they were watching the early construction of one of the most recognized brands in the history of American business. Because Harlan Sanders never told them what he was building. He never gave the doubt that surrounded him the one thing it needed to become truly dangerous: information. He kept his plan in the back seat with the pressure cooker, and he kept driving. And by the time the world finally understood what he had built, it was already built, and there was nothing left to doubt. Think about that for a moment. How many plans have died not because they were bad plans, but because they were shared too early with someone whose doubt got inside them before they were strong enough to survive it? How many ideas have been quietly talked out of existence in a conversation that started with excitement and ended with a reason why it probably would not work? Harlan Sanders avoided every one of those conversations by simply never having them. And what he built in that silence became one of the most recognizable faces and brands in the world. There is one more man in this story. A man who was not homeless once, but twice. And who built $2 billion empires that the people closest to him never saw coming. Because he never let them see what he was doing until it was already done. John Paul DeJoria was homeless twice. Not once, the way most difficult origin stories are told, but twice. He slept in his car. He lived without a permanent address at two separate points in his adult life, separated by years of trying and failing and trying again. And during both of those periods, and during the rebuilds that followed each of them, John Paul DeJoria operated with an intensity of privacy that the people around him never fully understood. He did not share his plans. He did not sit down with the people closest to him and walk them through what he was going to build and how he was going to build it. He did not ask for opinions on whether it would work. He simply worked, in private, with the same quiet relentlessness that Ronald Read had brought to a desk in a Vermont kitchen and Harlan Sanders had brought to the back roads of America in a white suit. The people who knew John Paul DeJoria during his homeless period saw exactly what they expected to see: a man with nothing, going through something difficult, whose future was genuinely uncertain. They had no idea they were standing next to someone who would go on to co-found Paul Mitchell Hair Products with a $700 investment and build it into a brand sold in salons across the entire country, and then build Patron Tequila into one of the most recognized premium spirits brands in the world. They had no idea because he never told them. He never asked them whether they thought it would work. And that was not an accident. John Paul DeJoria understood something about silence that most people spend their whole lives never grasping. That other people's doubt is only dangerous if you give it access to your plans. Silence is not secrecy. It is armor. It protects what you are building during the period when it is most vulnerable, before it exists, when it is nothing more than an intention in your mind that a single well-meaning but discouraging conversation could permanently extinguish. And here is the hardest part of this truth for most people to accept. The people most likely to discourage you are almost never your enemies. They are the people who care about you most, your family, your closest friends, the people who genuinely do not want to watch you fail. They discourage you because they are trying to protect you from disappointment. But their protection, accepted too early, before what you are building is strong enough to survive contact with doubt, becomes the exact thing that prevents the outcome they were trying to protect you from missing. Ronald Read knew this. Harlan Sanders knew this. John Paul DeJoria knew this. And they all responded to it the same way, with silence, with privacy, and with results that spoke so loudly when they finally arrived that nobody who had doubted them could say a single word in response. Ronald Read built $8 million in complete silence. Harlan Sanders built one of the most recognized brands in American history from the back seat of a car that nobody was watching. John Paul DeJoria built $2 billion empires while the people closest to him had no idea what he was doing. 3 different men, 3 different industries, 3 different eras of American history, and the same principle running through all of them like a thread. They never built their fortunes by telling anyone what they were building. They built their fortunes by building. And the science of why that worked is not complicated. It is just rarely taught, because a culture built on visibility and validation has very little financial interest in telling you to be quiet and get to work. So here's what you do with this. 3 things, starting today. The first is this: stop announcing goals before you have evidence to show. The announcement is not the work. Posting about what you are going to build, telling people what you are planning to do, sharing the intention before the result exists, none of that is progress. It feels like progress because the social response to the announcement gives you a taste of the recognition that was supposed to come at the end. But Ronald Read did not post about his investment strategy. Harlan Sanders did not tell his family he was building a franchise empire. John Paul DeJoria did not ask for opinions on whether Paul Mitchell would work. They worked. And when the work was done, the world found out on its own. The second thing is this: identify the 2 or 3 people in your life whose opinions you seek before you begin something new. You know who they are. And ask yourself honestly, not the comfortable version of the answer, but the real one. Has their validation ever actually made you more likely to succeed? Or has it simply made you feel better about doing less? Because there is a significant difference between the 2, and most people have spent years confusing one for the other. The people whose opinions you seek before you begin are not always the people whose opinions serve what you are trying to build. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do for what you are building is to stop asking. And the third thing, build the evidence first and share the story after. Ronald Read's story became public the day his estate was opened, when the evidence was $8 million and completely undeniable. Harlan Sanders' story became public when Kentucky Fried Chicken was already a nationwide brand. John Paul DeJoria's story became public when Paul Mitchell was already in salons across the country and Patron was already on shelves around the world. None of them shared the intention. They shared the result. And the result made the story impossible to argue with. Let results create the narrative, not intentions. Because intentions invite doubt, and doubt invited too early is the single most reliable way to kill something before it has the chance to become undeniable. The quietest builders in American history were never quiet because they lacked confidence. They were quiet because they understood something most people never learn. That silence is not the absence of ambition. It is the protection of it. Ronald Read never told a single person what he was building. Not the customers he served for decades at that gas station on Putney Road in Brattleboro, Vermont. Not the people he worked beside at JCPenney. Not his neighbors who watched him drive the same old car and pin his coat together rather than buy a new one. For nearly 70 years, he built in complete and total silence. And when the world finally saw what he had built, the number was $8 million. It worked, not despite the silence, because of it. So here is the question I want to leave you with today. What is one thing you have been building quietly, something you have not told anyone about yet, something you have been protecting carefully from the doubt of the people around you, that is still alive precisely because you never announced it? Tell me in the comments below. Or do not. Ronald Reed would understand either way. And if this video gave you something real to think about today, next week we are going back to the story of a man who was so broke he sold his dog for $25 to buy food. 3 weeks later, he was sitting across a table from producers who were offering him $350,000 for a screenplay he had written in 3.5 days. And what he did next, the decision he made when he had absolutely nothing and was handed the chance to have everything, is one of the most extraordinary decisions any man in Hollywood history has ever made. That story is coming next on The Silent Fortunes. If this gave you something real today, a lesson, a perspective, a reason to protect what you are quietly building a little more carefully than you did yesterday, subscribe to The Silent Fortunes. Because every single week we come back here and uncover another story the world forgot to tell.